February of 2014, pro-Russian protests racked parts of southeastern Ukraine, and Russian soldiers, their uniforms and weapons, stripped of flags and other identifying markers, occupied another part of Ukraine called Crimea. This was seemingly in response to Ukraine's overthrow of its pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was toppled as part of the Euromaidan protests, which were themselves a response to Yanukovych deciding to aim for closer ties with Russia rather than signing an association agreement with the European Union, which would have committed Ukraine to several EU-oriented reforms related to corruption, among other things, while also giving Ukrainians many new rights, including visa-free movement and access to the European Investment Bank, beginning a few years later in 2017. This sudden pivot away from the EU and toward Russia did not go down well with Ukrainian citizens who had repeatedly shown that they wanted to lean toward the West, and the Euromaidan protests were focused on weeding out government corruption. The existing government was accused of being all sorts of corrupt and had also been accused of human rights abuses and allowing Russian oligarchs undue influence at the highest rungs of power. Yanukovych was in Russia's pocket, basically, and his overthrow made Russia worry that they would lose control of their neighbor. So Russia moved in to take part of Ukraine, basically uncontested, both internally and externally. A lot of other governments made upset noises about this, but Russia gave itself cover by removing their flags from their personnel. That gave them deniability, and that gave them the ability to paint everything that happened as just a natural uprising from within Ukraine. The people wanting freedom from their Ukrainian oppressors, and Russia was just supporting, later, this cry to overthrow oppressive tyrants because they are very nice and love freedom. For the next 8 years, the Ukrainian government fought separatist forces, funded and reinforced by the Russian government, in the southeastern portion of their country, while Russia expanded their infrastructure in Crimea, which again, they stole from Ukraine in those early days, and where they previously leased vital naval facilities from Ukraine. And those facilities are assumed to be a big part of why all of this went down the way it did, as without said facilities, Russia would not have a naval presence in the Black Sea. Then, in February of 2022, after a multi-month buildup of troops and military hardware along their shared border, which they provided all sorts of excuses for, and which many commentators and governments around the world excused as just a bunch of saber-rattling, nothing to worry about, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, initially aiming for a blitzkrieg-like assault that was meant to take Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, and decapitate the country's government within just a few days, at which point they could replace that government with someone who's working for them as just another puppet that they control. As of the day I'm recording this, in early March of 2025, the war is still ongoing, though, and in the years since it began, it's estimated that more than 1 million people have been killed or injured, while entire cities across Ukraine have been leveled, and tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees have fled Russia's forces as they have raped and pillaged and murdered their way across the Ukrainian countryside. Those refugees leaving for destinations around the world, but creating a small refugee crisis in nearby European nations like Poland and Germany in particular. There's been a lot of back and forth in this conflict. Russia initially thought to have a massive upper hand, probably winning within days as intended, but then Ukraine held fast. Russia redeployed its troops and armor, Ukraine got some remarkable counterattacks in, and then Russia started to reset its economy to allow for a more drawn-out conflict. As of early 2025, Russia is again considered to have the upper hand, and though Ukraine has been holding the line even in the most under-assault regions in the eastern portion of its territory, and even though Ukraine has in recent weeks managed to take some Russian-held territory back, Russia's comparably larger number of troops, its recent resupply of armaments and soldiers from North Korea, its larger economy and its larger number of supply chains, and its relationships with entities like China and Iran, in addition to North Korea, all of which have been supplying it with things that it needs to keep the war effort going at length, have conspired to put Ukraine on the back foot. Additionally, Ukraine is struggling, after this many years of total war, to refill its ranks, to fill empty boots, and to make do with whatever their allies can and will offer them in terms of money and food and weapons and things like fuel. They've been able to shore up some limited aspects of their economy, and they've innovated like crazy when it comes to things like drones and other fundamentals of asymmetric defensive warfare. But right now, at least, the larger forces swirling around the geopolitical realm are making life difficult for Ukraine and for those who are still supporting them. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. The continuing conflict in Ukraine, but especially what's happening on the sidelines, beyond the battle itself, and how those sideline happenings might lead to some fundamental changes in how Europe is organized and the makeup of the modern world order. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. At this point, I've done probably half a dozen or more episodes on this conflict. It's long-lasting, it's big, it's important locally within Eurasia, but also globally, and it's been informing both geopolitical and economic outcomes since day one. Today, I'd like to talk about some recent happenings, most of them from the past few months, that could prove impactful on the eventual outcome of this conflict, and might even determine when that end of fighting arrives. And at the center of these happenings is recently re-elected US President Trump, who has always had a, let's call it, unusual public appreciation for Russian President Putin, and the strongman image he and other global authoritarians wield, while at the same time not being a big fan of Ukrainian President Zelensky, perhaps in part because Trump called Zelensky back in 2019 to try to get him to come up with evidence supporting a debunked conspiracy theory about his opponent, Joe Biden, and his alleged impropriety in US-Ukrainian relations. Zelensky could find no such evidence, and when he told Trump that there was nothing to be found, Trump blocked payments on $400 million worth of military aid for Ukraine, holding it hostage basically until Zelensky came up with what he wanted. This became a big scandal only after the fact, and before it could be made public or become known by Congress via a whistleblower complaint, Trump did release the money. But this led to a formal impeachment inquiry into Trump later that year, which led to his impeachment for abusing his power and obstructing Congress. But he was later acquitted by the Republican-controlled Senate. This, it is thought, may have colored Trump's behavior toward Zelensky when the two men sat down alongside several other U.S. officials, including U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, to discuss a potential mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, which was based on an earlier deal that the Ukrainian government dismissed. The original deal basically required that Ukraine exploit its mineral wealth and put half of the money it makes from those minerals into a fund that would be used to pay the U.S. back for the military assistance it has provided so far to the tune of $500 billion, which is quite a lot more than the $175 billion or so that the U.S. has spent on this conflict since Russia invaded, only $128 billion of which has directly aided the Ukrainian government. The rest has been funding U.S. activities associated with the war and supporting other affected countries in the region. So originally, the U.S. asked for more than double what it has provided so far in return, paid for by Ukraine's mineral wealth, which includes a lot of the types of rare earth minerals that are vital for common modern technologies, like computers and batteries, microchips, and solar panels. That did not fly, mostly because it did not contain a security guarantee for Ukraine. The US saying that in exchange for all this money, it would protect them if necessary. So the New Deal asked for $500 billion to be placed into a fund with basically the same premises where that money would come from, but that fund would instead be jointly controlled by the US and Ukraine, and the funds, instead of just going back into American coffers, would be used to rebuild Ukraine after the war. 50% of all revenues from Ukrainian natural resources newly exploited after the war, so not from existing mines and wells and such, that money would be put into this fund. And like the first time around, this deal did not include a security agreement from the US, but the general idea was that this fund would incentivize new investment in the area, and because Ukraine has a lot of unexploited mineral wealth, this could give the US a new source for these sorts of valuable raw materials that are currently mostly controlled by China. And the US government is attempting to claim more of these sorts of minerals now that it's realized it's way behind on locking down these things at a moment in which they are absolutely vital. Now, at the meeting where this second deal was meant to be signed, Zelensky flying into the US to sit down with Trump to make it happen, the president and vice president more or less verbally attacked Zelensky, criticizing him for not being more overtly grateful and telling him that he was wrong when he said that Russia started the war by invading Ukraine. It was all pretty bizarre, and even folks in Trump's own party, who toe the line in absolutely every other regard, seemed pretty puzzled by the whole thing, some of them calling it embarrassing, as Trump and Vance were basically parroting Putin's propaganda that no one actually believes because they can be disproven by easily verifiable facts and evidence. In any event, this led to a lot of fallout between the US and Ukrainian governments, with Trump suggesting he would lean more heavily on Ukraine to get them to accept peace on Russia's terms, because the Ukrainians could not see reason and accept his version of reality, essentially. Trump also suggested that he has been talking a lot with Putin, and that he believes Putin wants peace, and it's time to end the war. Putin, for his part, has not seemed inclined to give up anything in order to achieve peace, and Russian attacks on Ukraine have increased in scale since Trump came into office, and even more so after talks about a supposed peace agreement began. So Trump seems to be aligning the US with Russia and Russia's priorities for inexplicable reasons. Ukraine, which previously had the United States support, seems to suddenly not have that support. Trump is saying that they might give Ukraine more support if they hand over a bunch of stuff, but when they tried to hand over all that stuff, it seemed a lot like the US president and vice president did their best to derail those talks, despite fighting so hard to make them successful in the first place. All of which is very confusing for everybody, and all of which has had a huge number of implications on the ground. In Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers have had to operate with fewer resources as Trump cut off additional funding and supply shipments post-meeting. He recently ordered that the US not share intelligence with them as well, and they cut off the sharing of satellite imagery, which Ukraine has used to great effect to strike Russian targets deep into Russia and into Russian-held Ukrainian territory from a distance. This has also had implications across Europe, though, as while Ukraine is being invaded today, there are concerns that if Putin gets away with taking part or all of Ukraine, he will go for other previous Soviet assets next. Maybe starting with the smaller and much weaker Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then tearing off chunks of Poland and Finland, or other neighbors that were previously part of the Soviet Union, like Eastern Germany. The European Union, despite having a fair bit of warning about Trump's potential stance on this issue, and the possibility that he would return to office, has been seemingly caught flat-footed and is very dumbstruck by Trump's sudden pivot away from supporting Ukraine, and away from NATO more broadly, toward a stance that favors Russia instead. European governments have been scrambling to come up with an aid package that would replace some of what the US would have given, and have started sharing more intelligence as well, including satellite imagery. It won't be easy, though, as the US version of these things, from monetary resources to eyes in the sky, all vastly outshine what even the combination of British and French and German assets can offer, at least at this moment. And the US has traditionally handled the lion's share of spending and building in these areas, shouldering the majority of NATO spending because, well, it could. And that was the major premise of the post-World War II Western-led world order. The United States said it would protect global capitalistic democracies with its military might and nukes, if necessary, and European nations have been generally happy with this setup as it has generally allowed European governments to spend less money on military stuff and more on everything else. That state of affairs seems to have ended, or at the very least become too unreliable to bet on. So EU nations are attempting to fill the gaps left by the suddenly less reliable seeming US government, not just for Ukraine, but for themselves as well. Poland's president recently announced that he wants to develop nuclear weapons and wants every adult male in the country to undergo military training so the country can field an army 500,000 strong. The French president has said he wants to extend his country's nuclear umbrella, guaranteed deterrence basically, using nuclear weapons, to the whole of the European Union. France has far fewer nukes than the US and Russia, but this captures a sense of the moment in the Union, where a bunch of currently underfunded militaries are realizing they might not be able to rely on the US in a pinch. And while they collectively have a lot more people and resources than Russia, Russia is fully mobilized and has shown itself to be willing to attack sovereign nations whenever it pleases, caring a lot less for the human lives it spends as well in the process than is typical in Western-style democracies. Even short of full-scale, out-of-nowhere invasions, though, Russia could pose a threat to European governments via asymmetric approaches. It's been seemingly approving all sorts of espionage operations meant to increase immigration arrivals in European nations, where immigration is already a hot-button political issue, nudging politics toward the far right in the process. And it's allegedly been attacking infrastructure in terms of hacking and just blowing stuff up in order to sow discord and fear, which also then tends to nudge politics toward the right via militarism and security guarantees. As I mentioned earlier too, part of Germany was previously held by the Soviet Union, and that same part of the country reliably votes heavily in favor of the country's furthest right party, which wants stronger ties with Russia. So while conventional military issues are at the forefront of discussion right now, Russia's long history of asymmetric warfare is also getting a fair bit of attention, as it could conceivably use these groups in places like Eastern Germany as a casus belli to attack, carving off pieces of its European neighbors and slowly incorporating them into its sphere of influence, similar to what it did in Ukraine beginning in 2014. If Eastern Germany supports Russia, Russia could fund and in other ways support the radical political groups in these areas and stoke uprisings in these regions, creating chaos and potentially even breaking off separatist states that would then pull those regions into Russia's orbit and maybe even give Russia an excuse to attack, saying that they are just supporting these freedom-loving separatist groups. It's a tumultuous moment in this part of the world then, in part because of the conflict that's still ongoing, a much larger and more powerful nation having invaded its smaller, less powerful neighbor. But it is also tumultuous because of the implications of that conflict, especially if Russia comes out on top. If they win, there would seem to be a far greater chance of their deciding to keep the ball rolling, replicating a model that worked without significant long-term consequences across more neighboring nations. And if they can do that before Europe reinforces itself, assuming that's what the EU does, as it can be difficult to get a bunch of people with a bunch of at times competing interests to agree on anything, and that's even more true when said agreement involves both spending money and potentially sending civilians into harm's way. If Russia can get there before a new, restructured, and reinforced Europe emerges, we could see another similar conflict soon, and this one could be even more successful than the last if Russia tweaks its formula to make it more effective. And if European governments succumb to war weariness, exhausted by the war in Ukraine, and therefore not spending appropriately on their defenses in the meantime. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Stormfront by Jim Butcher. This is the first book of the Dresden Files, which is a pretty large, kind of pulpy urban fantasy series that involves wizards and other types of magic, set in the first book at least, a 1980s era Chicago. And I've been meaning to read this series forever. It's gone on to influence a bunch of other authors and the genre as a whole, but never got around to it till now. It's a whole lot of fun. I'm on the third book at this point, and I'm still just plowing through these books. They're pretty quick reads, but they are also a fun example of the urban fantasy with a main character who's kind of a pseudo-detective slice of the genre. And that main character is also a very flawed protagonist who is also the narrator, and his internal monologue at times is pretty funny and interesting. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Stormfront by Jim Butcher. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.